The ground shakes, not from artillery, not from bombs, from something far worse. 17 Panzer tanks roll through the frozen French countryside, their steel tracks grinding ancient cobblestones into dust. December 1944. The temperature has dropped to 14 degrees below zero. And standing between these metal monsters and an entire American field hospital is one man. Private First Class Charles Carpenter crouches behind a snow-covered hedgerow, his breath forming ice crystals in the air. His fingers, numb from cold, grip something that makes absolutely no sense. A Piper L-4 grasshopper, a fabric-covered observation plane, a flying kite that weighs less than half a ton. And strapped to its wings, 6 bazookas. The lead Panzer is 300 yards away, then 250. The commander's hatch opens. A German officer scans the horizon with binoculars, looking for American armor. He never thinks to look up. Carpenter's engine sputters to life. The tiny plane lurches forward across a frozen field that was never meant to be a runway. Ice cracks beneath his wheels. In 90 seconds, he will either become America's most unconventional tank killer or a fireball in the French sky. How did a former history teacher from Illinois end up here, flying a toy airplane against Hitler's finest armor? Urbana, Illinois. 1938. Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter doesn't exist yet. There's only Charles Carpenter, 26 years old, wire-rimmed glasses, a passion for ancient Roman military tactics, and a teaching position at the local high school that pays $42 a month. His students remember him as quiet, methodical, the kind of teacher who would spend an entire class period explaining why Hannibal's elephants failed at Zama, drawing diagrams on the chalkboard with obsessive precision. He wasn't the type you'd imagine storming a beach, one former student later recalled. He was the type you'd imagine in a library, surrounded by dusty books, arguing about footnotes. Carpenter had a secret, though. Every weekend he drove 30 miles to a grass airstrip outside Champaign. There, he rented a Piper J3 Cub for $3 an hour. He taught himself to fly, not through military precision or academy training, but through trial and error, through crashed landings and broken propellers, through the kind of stubborn persistence that would later define his legend. By 1941, he had logged over 400 flight hours, most of them alone, most of them in aircraft that cost less than a new Ford. When Pearl Harbor burned, Carpenter was 30 years old. Too old for fighter pilot training, too educated for infantry, according to the Army's Byzantine classification system. Too ordinary. He enlisted anyway. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, looked at his flight hours and assigned him to the liaison pilot program. His job? Fly observation missions, spot enemy positions, radio coordinates back to artillery, never engage, never attack. Never even carry a weapon heavier than a service pistol. His aircraft? The Piper L-4 Grasshopper. Military designation for the same J3 Cub he'd learned on back in Illinois. Maximum speed, 85 miles per hour. Armament, none. Armor, none. Construction, fabric stretched over a steel tube frame. A real pilot, a P-51 Mustang pilot, a B-17 pilot, could tear through a grasshopper's wing with his bare hands. Carpenter's flying a kite, the fighter jocks laughed. Hope the Germans don't sneeze on him. They had no idea what that kite would become. To understand what Charles Carpenter accomplished, you must first understand what he was facing. By late 1944, the Allied advance through France had stalled. The lightning victories of summer, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the race across Belgium had given way to something far grimmer. Supply lines stretched thin across 500 miles of contested territory. Fuel ran short, ammunition ran shorter, and the Germans, despite months of retreat, were not finished. They were planning something. The German Panzer divisions of 1944 were not the invincible force of 1940, but they remained terrifyingly effective. The Panther tank, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 yards, well beyond the range at which American tanks could reply. The Tiger farm was even worse. Weighing 57 tons, protected by 120 millimeters of frontal armor, armed with the dreaded 80-meter cannon, a single Tiger could hold an entire crossroads against a company of Shermans. American tankers had a saying, "It takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger. The first 4 are just to get his attention." They weren't joking. In the autumn of 1944, American armored units suffered casualty rates approaching 40%. Tank crews learned to sleep in their vehicles, engines running, ready to flee at the first sight of a German muzzle flash. Against this backdrop, the idea of attacking a Panzer with anything less than overwhelming force seemed suicidal. Attacking one with a fabric airplane? Insanity. Major Charles Carpenter arrived in France in September 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division's Artillery Observation Section. His job was simple: fly low, spot Germans, report back. For 3 weeks, he did exactly that. And for 3 weeks, he watched American soldiers die. The frustration was unbearable, he wrote in a letter home that was later declassified. I would see German positions, machine gun nests, mortar teams, even tanks, and all I could do was radio coordinates and hope our artillery was faster than their trigger fingers. It usually wasn't. The Army's official position was clear: liaison pilots observe. They do not engage. Their aircraft cannot survive combat. Carpenter disagreed. In early October, he approached the division's ordnance officer with an unusual request: 6 M1A1 bazooka launchers and a welding kit. "What the hell for?" the officer asked. "I'm going to strap them to my airplane." The officer laughed. Then he saw Carpenter's face. "You're serious." "Deadly serious." The M1A1 bazooka was a 2.36-inch rocket launcher designed for infantry anti-tank use. It weighed 13 pounds, fired a shaped charge projectile capable of penetrating up to 3 inches of armor, and had an effective range of approximately 150 yards. Mounting it to an aircraft presented several problems. First, the rocket's backblast. When fired from the shoulder, the bazooka vented its exhaust behind the shooter. Mounted on a wing, that exhaust would tear through fabric and ignite fuel lines. Second, the aiming mechanism. Bazookas were designed to be aimed by human eyes along iron sights. How do you aim 6 of them simultaneously from a moving aircraft? Third, the firing mechanism. The bazooka required electrical ignition. The L4 Grasshopper's electrical system was designed to power a radio and navigation lights, not weapons. Carpenter solved each problem with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years diagramming Roman siege equipment. For the backblast, he extended the launch tubes 4 inches beyond the wing's trailing edge, angling them slightly downward. The exhaust would clear the aircraft entirely. For aiming, he welded a simple iron sight to his cockpit frame, calibrated through dozens of test flights over empty French fields. At a dive angle of 30 degrees and an airspeed of 60 miles per hour, the rockets would strike approximately where the sight indicated. For firing, he wired the bazookas to a modified doorbell button mounted on his control stick. 1 press, 1 rocket. 6 presses, 6 rockets. He painted the nose art himself, a cartoon rocket riding a bomb. The name, Rosie the Rocketer. When he taxied past the fighter strip on his first armed mission, a P-47 pilot nearly fell out of his cockpit laughing. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" Carpenter smiled. "Tank killer." The laughter stopped 3 days later. By mid-December, the Allied High Command believed the war was nearly won. Intelligence assessments predicted that Germany would collapse by spring. The front lines had stabilized. The initiative belonged to Eisenhower. They were catastrophically wrong. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last major German offensive of the war. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The attack achieved complete surprise. Within hours, entire American divisions were encircled or destroyed. The front line, which had seemed so solid, bent backward in a massive bulge that threatened to split the Allied armies in two. At the spearhead of the German advance, Panzer columns racing toward the Meuse River crossings. If they reached those bridges, they could cut off the Allied supply lines and potentially reverse the entire course of the war. Standing in their path was a patchwork of American units, some veteran, some newly arrived, all desperately outnumbered. And one man in a fabric airplane. Charles Carpenter didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the most unconventional tank killer of World War II. December 17, 1944. Home fight for 7 hours. The radio crackled to life in the pre-dawn darkness, yanking Carpenter from 3 hours of fitful sleep. All units, German armor moving through Trois Ponts, battalion strength minimum, request immediate reconnaissance. Carpenter was airborne within 11 minutes. The Grasshopper's engine coughed in the frozen air, oil thick as molasses, until the cylinders warmed. Ice crystals had formed on the wing fabric overnight. He scraped them off with his bare hands, no time for gloves, and felt the skin of his palms stick momentarily to the frozen metal struts. Temperature at ground level, 8 degrees below zero. Temperature at 500 feet. Colder. He flew east into a sky the color of bruised steel, following the road network toward Trois Ponts. Below him, the Ardennes forest stretched endless and silent, snow-covered pines hiding God knew how many German soldiers. At 6:23 hours, he found them. The column stretched nearly a mile along the narrow road, 18 vehicles total, 2 Panther tanks at the lead, 4 Panzer in the middle, a mix of half-tracks, armored cars, and supply trucks filling out the rest. Infantry marched alongside in their distinctive coal scuttle helmets, breath steaming in the frozen air. Carpenter keyed his radio. Dogface 6, this is Rosie. I have visual on enemy armor, grid reference 847293. 18 vehicles, including 6 tanks. Request artillery support, static. Dogface. 6, do you copy? I have enemy armor in the open. Request immediate fire mission, more static. Then a voice, broken and distant. Rosie, this is Dogface 6. Negative on fire support. All batteries engaged at Stavelot. You are instructed to maintain observation only. Do not, repeat, do not engage. Carpenter watched the column roll forward. At its current pace, it would reach the crossroads at Habillemont within 40 minutes. Beyond that crossroads lay the field hospital of the 47th Evacuation Unit. 400 wounded American soldiers, 60 nurses, 0 armored protection. He did the math in his head. Even if artillery became available, even if they could hit a moving column, even if every shell found its target, the Germans would reach that hospital first, unless someone slowed them down. Dogface 6, I'm going in. Negative, Rosie. You are not. Carpenter switched off his radio. He had never fired a bazooka from an aircraft at a moving target. He had practiced on stationary wrecks, on abandoned farmhouses, on anything that didn't shoot back. This was different. The lead Panther was 200 yards ahead, its commander standing half-exposed in the turret hatch, scanning the sky with binoculars, looking for American fighters, looking for P-47s or P-51s, not looking for a fabric kite. Carpenter pushed the stick forward and dove. The Grasshopper's airspeed indicator climbed 50 bph, 60, 70. The engine screamed in protest. The entire airframe shuddered. At 400 feet, he was directly above the column. At 300 feet, he was committed. At 200 feet, he pressed the button. The rocket leaped from the wing with a sound like ripping canvas and missed. The projectile struck the road 3 feet in front of the lead Panther, spraying cobblestones and frozen earth across the tank's hull. The German commander ducked instinctively, then looked up in disbelief. He was being attacked by a toy. Carpenter pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and banked left. Machine gun fire erupted below. The half-tracks had recovered from their surprise and were filling the sky with tracers. A bullet punched through his left wing, leaving a hole the size of a silver dollar. He didn't notice. Circle back, reassess, try again. This was the Roman way. This was how Scipio defeated Hannibal, not through overwhelming force, but through adaptation, through learning faster than your enemy. Carpenter had 5 rockets left. The column had stopped, tanks spreading out from the road to make themselves harder targets. Smart, professional, these were veterans, but spreading out meant they were no longer protected by each other's anti-aircraft fire. And it meant they were thinking about threats from above, not threats from directly ahead. He came in low this time, 20 feet off the frozen fields, hedge-hopping like a crop duster back in Illinois. The Panthers' commander never saw him coming. 50 yards. Fire. The rocket struck the Panthers' rear deck, just behind the turret. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out, flames licking at their heels. 1 down. "That's for the hospital," Carpenter muttered. 4 rockets left. 17 vehicles to go. By 0700 hours, the German column was in chaos. What had begun as a disciplined armored advance had devolved into a scattered mess of vehicles seeking cover beneath trees, infantry diving into ditches, and commanders screaming conflicting orders into radio handsets, all because of one man in a fabric airplane. Carpenter had destroyed 2 tanks in his first 6 passes, the lead Panther and a Panzer IV that made the mistake of stopping in an open field. His remaining 4 rockets were gone, expended on near misses and 1 spectacular hit on a half-track that had been carrying ammunition. The explosion had been visible for miles. But now, Rosie the Rocketer was empty. The bazookas were just dead weight, useless tubes dangling from wings that had accumulated 11 bullet holes. Any sane pilot would have turned for home. Carpenter turned toward the enemy. What the Germans didn't know, or couldn't know, was that his rockets were exhausted. All they knew was that every time that damned airplane dove toward them, something exploded. So Carpenter kept diving. He would pick a target, push the nose down, scream toward the enemy at maximum speed, and pull up at the last moment, guns empty, rocket spent, bluffing with his life on the line. And it worked. Each time he dove, the column scattered. Tank commanders buttoned up inside their vehicles, sacrificing visibility for protection. Infantry abandoned their positions along the road, half-tracks reversed blindly, crashing into each other. "He attacked us again and again," a German sergeant named Wilhelm Kessler later testified during his post-war interrogation. "We were certain he had unlimited ammunition. How else could he keep coming? We thought there must be more of them, a whole squadron of these rocket planes. We didn't know it was just one man." For 37 minutes, Charles Carpenter held an entire Panzer column in place through sheer audacity. But audacity has limits. At 7:41 hours, fuel running critical, Carpenter finally turned for home. He had bought the 47th Evacuation Hospital nearly an hour, enough time for the wounded to be loaded onto trucks, enough time for the nurses to evacuate, enough time for a scratch force of tank destroyers to reach the crossroads ahead of the Germans. When he landed at the improvised strip behind American lines, his crew chief took one look at Rosie and crossed himself. "Sir, you can't fly this thing again?" "Why not?" The crew chief pointed at the wings. Carpenter counted the holes for the first time. 14. One had passed within 6 inches of his fuel tank. Another had severed a control cable that, by all rights, should have sent him spinning into the ground. "Give me 2 hours," Carpenter said, "and more rockets." He was airborne again by noon. Word spread through German command channels with unusual speed. By December 18th, reports of the Jabos mit Raketen, rocket-firing fighter bombers, had reached divisional headquarters. The initial assumption was that the Americans had deployed a new weapon system, some kind of modified fighter aircraft, carrying anti-tank rockets. The reality that a single observation plane piloted by a former schoolteacher was responsible seemed too absurd to consider. According to declassified German documents recovered after the war, a bounty was placed on Carpenter's head by December 19th. The exact amount remains disputed. Some sources claim 1,000 Reichsmarks, others suggest it was double that. But the intent was clear. Someone wanted the rocket plane destroyed. Anti-aircraft assets were redirected from strategic targets to cover armored columns. Tank commanders received explicit orders. When the rocket plane appears, all available weapons are to engage immediately. Mobility becomes secondary to air defense. In other words, Carpenter had become such a threat that the Germans were willing to sacrifice tactical flexibility just to stop him. One of the most detailed enemy perspectives comes from Feldwebel, Staff Sergeant Heinrich Müller, a tank commander in the 2nd Panzer Division. His diary, recovered from a destroyed Panther near Cels, describes an encounter on December 20th. Und 9:30 hours. We spotted the small aircraft at approximately 600 meters altitude, approaching from the northwest. At first, Hauptmann Brandt dismissed it as a reconnaissance plane, no threat to armor. Then someone noticed the objects mounted on its wings. The order came to disperse, but before we could move, the plane dove. I have been under artillery bombardment. I have been strafed by American fighters. Nothing prepared me for this. The rocket struck Feldwebel Krause's vehicle directly on the turret ring. The explosion was instantaneous. All 4 crew were killed. We fired everything we had at the plane as it climbed away. MG-34s, the coaxial machine gun, even the main cannon depressed to minimum elevation. We hit it. I saw pieces of fabric tear from its wing, but it didn't fall. It came back. 3 more passes before it finally departed. By then, we had lost 2 vehicles destroyed and 1 damaged. Our advance was delayed by 4 hours while we reorganized. Morale is suffering. The men are calling this plane Der Geist, the ghost. They say it cannot be killed. They say the pilot has made a pact with dark forces. I do not believe in dark forces, but I am beginning to believe in that pilot. The Germans tried several countermeasures against Carpenter's attacks. First, they attempted to concentrate anti-aircraft fire. When multiple vehicles combined their machine guns against a single target, even a small aircraft should have been overwhelmed. The problem was timing. Carpenter's attack runs lasted approximately 12 seconds from dive initiation to rocket release. In that window, gunners had to identify the threat, traverse their weapons, lead a moving target, and fire accurately. All while their vehicles were maneuvering for cover. Most couldn't do it. Second, they tried camouflage. Tanks would halt beneath tree cover, waiting for the rocket plane to pass before resuming movement. Carpenter adapted by flying lower, sometimes beneath the tree line, using terrain to mask his approach until he was almost on top of his targets. The risk was insane. One misjudgment, one unexpected tree, and Rosie would become a fireball. He never misjudged. Third, and most desperately, they tried to draw him into ambushes. A seemingly disabled tank would be left in the open as bait while hidden vehicles waited with every gun trained on the sky. Carpenter spotted the first ambush by noticing track marks in the snow that didn't match the disabled vehicle's position. He called in artillery instead. The ambush team didn't survive to try again. December 23, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its crisis point. German spearheads were within 4 miles of the Meuse River crossings. If they reached those bridges, the entire Allied position in Belgium could collapse. Patton's Third Army was racing north to relieve Bastogne, but they were still days away. Everything depended on holding the Germans back for just a little longer. At 1400 hours, Charles Carpenter received the mission that would define his legend. Aerial reconnaissance had identified a massive German armored formation assembling near Celle. 17 tanks, including 4 Tigers and 6 Panthers, supported by infantry and mobile artillery. Their objective, the bridge at Dinant. American ground forces in the area consisted of a single reconnaissance company equipped with armored cars and jeeps. They could observe, they could delay, they could not stop 17 tanks. Air support was requested. The response was devastating. Weather had grounded the heavy bombers. Fighter squadrons were committed to other sectors. Artillery was out of range. The only available asset was a single L-4 Grasshopper with 6 bazookas strapped to its wings. Carpenter didn't hesitate. He took off at 14:23 hours into a sky that was finally clearing after days of overcast. This was both blessing and curse. Good visibility meant he could find his targets, but it also meant they could see him coming. The German column was exactly where intelligence had reported, stretched along the road to Dinant like a steel serpent. Even from 1,000 feet, the Tigers were unmistakable. Massive, angular, deadly. Each one could kill a dozen Shermans. Each one was worth more than 100 fabric airplanes. Carpenter keyed his radio one final time. "Dogface 6, this is Rosie. I have visual on enemy armor. Am engaging. Rosie, be advised you have no support. Repeat, no support available. Recommend you maintain distance and observe. Negative, Dogface. If those tanks reach Dinant, we lose the bridge. I'm going in." He switched off the radio. What followed was later described by British military historian John Keegan as perhaps the most audacious single-pilot combat action of the Second World War. Carpenter didn't attack from above. The Tigers' top armor was their weakest point, but approaching from altitude gave the Germans too much warning, too much time to concentrate their fire. Instead, he came in from the east, directly out of the setting sun. The first Tiger never saw him. Carpenter dove to treetop level, skimming frozen fields at nearly 90 miles per hour, and released his first rocket at a range of less than 50 yards. The projectile struck the Tiger's rear engine deck and penetrated. The 57-ton monster ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its ventilation grills. Before the Germans could react, Carpenter banked hard left and lined up his second target, a Panther that was attempting to traverse its turret toward him. The rocket caught it in the side armor just below the turret ring. The ammunition inside cooked off. The turret lifted 6 feet into the air before crashing back down. 2 tanks destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Now the Germans knew he was there. The next 4 minutes were the longest of Charles Carpenter's life. Every vehicle in the column opened fire. Tracers filled the sky like angry fireflies. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar of machine guns, punctuated by the deeper bark of main cannon firing in desperation. Carpenter flew through it. His third rocket missed, skipping off a Tiger's sloped frontal armor and detonating harmlessly in a snowbank. His fourth hit, a Panzer IV in the tracks, immobilizing it but not destroying it. 2 rockets left. 15 enemy vehicles still combat-capable. He should have run. Any reasonable calculation of risk versus reward said to break off, return to base, rearm, try again later. But later might be too late. Later those tanks would reach Dinant. Later American soldiers would die. Carpenter pushed the stick forward and dove again. His 5th rocket struck a half-track loaded with infantry. The explosion scattered men like leaves in a windstorm. His 6th rocket, his last rocket, found the ammunition trailer being towed behind a supply truck. The detonation was cataclysmic. A column of fire rose 200 feet into the air, showering the entire formation with burning debris. 3 German vehicles caught fire from the falling embers alone. Rosie the rocketer limped home with 23 new holes in her fabric skin. The left aileron cable had been severed completely. Carpenter flew the last 15 miles using rudder and elevator alone. When he landed, more of a controlled crash than a landing, the ground crew simply stared. "How many?" his crew chief finally asked. Carpenter climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs. 2 Tigers, 1 Panther, 1 Panzer IV, 3 soft vehicles, plus whatever burned in the ammunition explosion. He paused. And we still have the bridge. That evening, the German column at Celle was destroyed by American armored reinforcements that arrived 6 hours after Carpenter's attack. Those 6 hours existed because one man in a fabric airplane had broken the column's momentum, scattered its formation, and convinced its commanders that the skies above were death. The bridge at Dinant never fell. When historians later compiled Charles Carpenter's combat record, the statistics seemed almost impossible. During the Battle of the Bulge alone, a period of approximately 6 weeks, Carpenter flew an estimated 85 combat sorties in Rosie the Rocketer. He fired 126 bazooka rockets. He destroyed or damaged 6 tanks confirmed destroyed, 8 tanks probably destroyed or damaged, 14 armored vehicles, half-tracks, armored cars, numerous soft-skinned vehicles, trucks, staff cars, motorcycles. An unknown number of enemy personnel. His total tank kills made him one of the highest-scoring American tank destroyers of the European theater. Not among pilots, among all tank destroyers, including Sherman crews and tank destroyer battalions. He accomplished this in an aircraft designed to carry nothing heavier than a camera. The Army's reaction to Carpenter's innovations was complicated. On one hand, his results were undeniable. Intelligence assessments credited his attacks with delaying German advances by measurable hours during the most critical phase of the Battle of the Bulge. The 47th Evacuation Hospital evacuation, made possible by his first attack, saved over 400 American lives. On the other hand, he had violated approximately 17 regulations regarding aircraft modification, ordnance handling, and mission parameters. He had operated independently without authorization. He had deliberately switched off his radio to avoid being ordered to abort. In a strictly bureaucratic sense, Charles Carpenter was as much a discipline problem as a hero. The Army solved this dilemma the way armies often do, by giving him medals and quietly hoping he didn't inspire too many imitators. Carpenter received the Silver Star for his actions during the Battle of the Bulge. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and gallantry, while carefully avoiding any mention of the unauthorized modifications that made his heroism possible. He also received 2 distinguished Flying Crosses, the Air Medal with clusters, and the Bronze Star. He was never promoted above Major. Private First Class Thomas Hendricks was a patient at the 47th Evacuation Hospital on December 17, 1944, the day Carpenter made his first attack. "We heard the tanks coming," Hendricks recalled in a 1987 interview. "That sound, you never forget it. Tanks have this rumble, this grinding noise that gets into your bones, and we knew we couldn't run. Half the guys in that hospital couldn't walk. The nurses were trying to stay calm, but you could see it in their eyes. They knew what was coming. We all knew. Then we heard something else, a small engine, like a lawnmower, and then explosions, 1, 2, 3, and the tank sounds stopped. We didn't know who saved us until weeks later, when I found out it was one guy in a plane made of fabric and prayers. I couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it." Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, later General Abrams, for whom the M1 Abrams tank would be named, commanded an armored battalion during the Bulge. He witnessed several of Carpenter's attacks. "That man did things that seemed impossible," Abrams stated in a post-war interview. "I've seen P-47s attack tanks with rockets and miss. I've seen heavy bombers try to hit armor and fail. And here's this little fabric plane flying slower than some cars drive, putting rockets into tank after tank." The Germans were terrified of him. Prisoners we captured talked about the ghost, like he was some kind of supernatural force. They couldn't understand how something so fragile could be so deadly. Neither could we, honestly. After the war, American intelligence officers interrogated numerous German soldiers who had experienced Carpenter's attacks. Their testimonies paint a picture of confusion, fear, and grudging respect. Oberleutnant Friedrich Becker, a company commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, "We had been told that American observation planes were unarmed. We had been told they were nothing to worry about. Someone forgot to inform the pilot of that small plane. When he first attacked my unit, I thought it must be a mistake. A reconnaissance plane carrying rockets? Impossible. But then Feldwebel Krause's tank exploded, and I realized the impossible was happening. After that, we feared the small planes more than the Jabos, fighter bombers. The Jabos were fast. You might not see them coming, but they were gone quickly. The small plane, it would circle, it would watch, and then it would strike exactly where you were weakest. I still dream about the sound of that little engine sometimes. Carpenter's success with a bazooka-armed grasshopper did not go unnoticed by military planners. In early 1945, the Army began experimenting with similar modifications to other liaison aircraft. The concept of using small, inexpensive planes for close air support attracted interest from commanders frustrated by the complexity and expense of dedicated ground attack aircraft. However, the program never achieved widespread deployment for several reasons. First, Carpenter's success depended heavily on his personal skills and audacity. Not every pilot could fly a fabric plane into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and survive. Second, the war was ending. By the time modified aircraft could be produced in numbers, Germany was collapsing. Third, technology was evolving. The development of helicopters and dedicated attack aircraft like the A-26 Invader offered more sophisticated solutions to the close air support problem. Still, Carpenter's innovations planted seeds that would eventually grow into the modern concept of armed reconnaissance. The idea that observation platforms could become weapon platforms, that the same aircraft gathering intelligence could also act on it, traced directly back to a history teacher from Illinois and his toy airplane. The Army's current fleet of armed drones owes an intellectual debt to Charles Carpenter, whether the Pentagon acknowledges it or not. Charles Carpenter came home to Illinois in 1945 with a chest full of medals and a head full of memories he rarely discussed. Unlike many combat veterans who struggled to readjust to civilian life, Carpenter returned to teaching with apparent ease. He resumed his position at Urbana High School, married his pre-war sweetheart Eleanor in June 1946, and settled into the kind of quiet, anonymous life he had lived before Pearl Harbor. His students in the post-war years had no idea that their soft-spoken history teacher had been one of the war's most unconventional heroes. He never mentioned it. When other teachers brought up their service, Carpenter would simply nod and change the subject. He taught us about ancient Roman tactics, recalled James Morrison, who took Carpenter's history class in 1952, about how smaller forces could defeat larger ones through innovation and courage. We thought he was just talking about Hannibal and Caesar. We had no idea he was talking about himself. Carpenter retired from teaching in 1972 and moved to a small farm outside Champaign. He continued flying recreationally until his late 60s, eventually selling his Piper Cub when his eyesight began to fail. He died on September 4, 1984, at the age of 72. His obituary in the Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette ran 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his teaching career, his military service, and his survivors. It did not mention Rosie the Rocketer. It did not mention 17 tanks. It did not mention the bridge at Dinant. A hero died in obscurity, and the world barely noticed. Charles Carpenter's relative anonymity is not unusual for World War II heroes. The war produced so many acts of courage, so many impossible victories, that individual stories inevitably faded into the collective memory. But Carpenter's case represents something more specific: the way military institutions handle innovations that don't fit established doctrine. The Army Air Forces of 1944-45 were dominated by strategic bombing advocates and fighter pilots. The liaison pilots, flying their slow, unglamorous observation planes, occupied the lowest rung of the aviation hierarchy. They were considered support personnel, not combat aviators. Carpenter's success challenged this hierarchy in uncomfortable ways. If a fabric-covered grasshopper could destroy tanks that P-47s struggled to hit, what did that say about the hundreds of millions of dollars invested in real combat aircraft? If a former history teacher could become one of the war's top tank killers, what did that say about the elaborate fighter pilot training programs? These were questions the post-war Air Force had no interest in answering, and so Charles Carpenter became a footnote. His story appeared in specialist publications, in unit histories, in academic papers, read by dozens rather than millions. The popular histories focused on Patton's tanks, on the Screaming Eagles at Bastogne, on the strategic bombing campaign, not on a school teacher with a welding kit and an impossible idea. In recent decades, Carpenter has begun to receive some of the recognition he deserved. In 1998, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired one of his modified bazooka launchers and included it in their aviation exhibit. The accompanying plaque tells a condensed version of his story. In 2012, military historian Stephen Ambrose briefly mentioned Carpenter in a revised edition of his Bulge history, calling him one of the war's most creative combat innovators. In 2019, the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Novosel, Alabama, added a section on liaison pilot combat modifications, prominently featuring Carpenter's Grasshopper. Most significantly, the modern armed reconnaissance community has adopted Carpenter as something of a patron saint. His photograph hangs in the operations room of at least one Army aerial reconnaissance unit, a reminder that innovation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. But Charles Carpenter never sought recognition. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews to military historians. He flew home, returned to teaching, and lived out his days in the quiet dignity of a man who knew what he had done and didn't need anyone else to validate it. What can we learn from Charles Carpenter? Perhaps that innovation doesn't require permission, that when the situation demands action, waiting for authorization might cost lives, that sometimes the right solution is the one that seems too crazy to work, or perhaps something simpler. Perhaps just that courage takes many forms, that heroism doesn't require a silver screen physique or a dramatic backstory, that a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a love of Roman history could become exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. He saved hundreds of American lives. He destroyed millions of dollars worth of enemy equipment. He held a bridge that could have changed the course of the war. And he did it with a toy airplane and 6 bazookas, December 17, 1944. The ground shakes with 17 Panzers rolling toward a field hospital full of wounded American soldiers. And a man in a fabric airplane makes a decision. He could follow orders. He could observe and report and wait for support that will never come. He could survive. Instead, Charles Carpenter switches off his radio, pushes his throttle forward, and dives toward certain death. He doesn't die. The tanks stop. The hospital survives. And a history teacher from Illinois becomes something more than the sum of his ordinary parts. We started this story with a question. How did a former school teacher end up attacking Panzers with a toy airplane? The answer, we now know, is both simple and profound. He saw a problem. He designed a solution. And when the moment came, he had the courage to trust himself. Charles Carpenter destroyed more German tanks than most Sherman crews. He earned medals that should have made him famous. He came home and taught high school for another 3 decades, never mentioning any of it. He lies now in a small cemetery outside Champaign, Illinois. His headstone mentions his military service, but not his nickname, not Bazooka Charlie, not the ghost. Just Charles Carpenter, beloved husband, devoted teacher, veteran. The grass grows over his grave, and most of the world has forgotten. But not everyone. In the operations room of an Army aviation unit in Kentucky, there's a photograph on the wall. A man standing next to a fabric-covered airplane with rockets strapped to its wings. Below the photograph, someone has written a quote attributed to Carpenter himself, though its authenticity cannot be verified. They told me what was possible. I decided to find out for myself. The next time someone tells you something can't be done, remember Charles Carpenter. Remember the laughter when they saw his toy. Remember the silence when it started destroying tanks. And remember that history's greatest heroes aren't always the ones who sought glory. Sometimes they're just teachers who decided to find out what was possible